Hello, this is Mike, and welcome to another episode of Urban Legends and Mythology. It is a beautiful thunderstormy evening here in Ohio, and to be honest, I always like thunderstorms. There's something about that chaotic, crazy weather that relaxes me. However, I'm not here to talk about thunderstorms today. On this episode, with this perfect background atmosphere, I am actually going to discuss a much requested topic: the life, the legacy, the legend of the father of American Gothic horror, Edgar Allan Poe. Now, we all know kind of the story of Poe. He is the archetypical tortured genius, a half-starved, impoverished writer whose dark tales were inspired by the tragedies of his life. He was the first well-known American writer to earn a living through writing alone, resulting in a very financially difficult career. This leads him to rampant alcoholism and leads him to being found in a gutter wearing another man's clothes and eventually dying in a hospital of an unknown sickness. Completely deranged and out of his mind, his tortured genius brought us great tales such as The Murders in the Rue Morgue, The Mask of Red Death, my personal favorite, The Count of Amontillado, The Telltale Heart, and the infamous poem The Raven. This is a guy that every teenager going through their goth stage instantly looks up to. Hell, my senior year of high school, I was that crazy goth kid reading the hell out of Edgar Allan Poe because I thought his stories were awesome. I still think they're awesome today. But as always, we are here to separate the truth from the legend, at least the best we can. We are here to find out the true story behind Edgar Allan Poe and maybe glean some of that madness or some of that genius which inspired these great novels or novellas and poems. So as always, let's take a delicious, refreshing drink of this cold one. Naturally, I have a Voodoo Ranger Fruit Force IPA because why the hell not? And let's start where we always do, right at the beginning. So this time our story begins on January 19th, 1809 in Boston, Massachusetts. So Edgar Poe, he was born the second child of two American actors. His father was a man named David Poe Jr., and his mother was an English-born actress by the name of Elizabeth Arnold Hopkins Poe. Now, he also had an older brother named Henry and a younger sister named Rosalie. However, unfortunately for him, he would not have a blissful childhood because at the age of like 2, his father abandons the family. Now, David and Eliza, being actors, they struggled financially, especially with 3 kids. And naturally, being stage actors, they had a very transient lifestyle. They would travel up and down the East Coast, going from essentially playhouse to playhouse, getting whatever acting gigs they could get. And his father was considered a very inferior actor. So being a struggling, unsuccessful actor drove him to rampant alcoholism. And already by 1809, he already disappears from the historical record, having abandoned his family while his wife was pregnant with Rosalie. However, there might be another reason why he abandons his family, which isn't really brought up, because his mother Eliza was suffering from consumption, also known as tuberculosis. And at this time, consumption is a death sentence. So it was essentially a combination of having 2 kids with one on the way, a wife who you know is going to die from a horrible, incurable disease, and basically being penniless, which led this guy to basically abandon everything. Personally, I guess he just didn't have it in him to be a man and step up to the challenge, but I digress. All we really know about what happens to his father comes from Poe in an 1835 letter where he states that his father died in 1811. However, the Poe children at this time, they're these young infants, and they're essentially with their mother, watching her waste away from this horrible disease. And consumption really is a horrible way to die. You literally waste away while coughing up blood. And it's believed that the Poe children were there while she was on her deathbed, and it's believed that this death really inspired a lot of his later works. At least maybe the imagery we get from him. It's believed that some of his earliest memories were probably of watching his own mother die from this horrible disease. So she dies towards the end of 1811, and after this the Poe children are separated. His older brother goes to live with his paternal grandparents. Rosalie ends up being adopted by a family by the last name Mackenzie who lived in Richmond, and she actually became a poet in her own right. She actually goes on to write several untitled poems that were published about 50 years after her death, but I digress. And young Edgar, he ends up being taken in by the Allan family, and this is where he receives the Allan part of his name. A lot of people believe that Allan is his middle name. However, it's not. It's his adopted family's last name that he took as his own. However, they never formally adopt him. They simply acted as his foster parent. And this was mostly due to the efforts of Mrs. Allan, who was either a friend or kind of a fan of Poe's mother, and upon her death took pity on the young Edgar and said, well, let's adopt him and give him a proper life, to which John agreed. Now, John Allan, he was a successful merchant in Richmond, Virginia. He dealt in a variety of goods, including cloth, wheat, tombstones, tobacco, slaves. You name it, he probably sold it. And even though he inherited most of his wealth, he made himself out to be like this self-made man, this self-made millionaire. He kind of embodied that idea that his hard work and his cunning is what made him the success that he was. And he tried to bring Poe up with that same kind of mindset. You have to be a hard-working, self-made man. And also, this being the early 1800s in Virginia, Poe was brought up in those aristocratic ways of being, I guess, the proper Southern gentleman. And Poe, he naturally takes to this. However, him and his foster father never quite see eye to eye. But I think part of that is because there were times when John Allan really spoiled him as a child, gave him anything he wanted, and John Allan would later go on to say that he was never grateful for anything that he gave him. He was never grateful for essentially adopting him off of the street and turning him into a proper Southern gentleman. But I think John Allan also wanted him to realize that this world is a tough place and you have to work hard and make your own way in it. Now, despite what everybody thinks, they think that he was just this person who was enamored with the literary world and, I don't know, a sickly child. That's not true at all. While he was very enamored with the literary world, he knew at a young age he wanted to pursue a literary career. He was never the sickly child that some people describe him as. He was actually the opposite. He was extremely athletic and he was a very bold leader amongst his peers. During his teenage years, his peers described him as being very vigorous and cheerful. When he's 15, he actually swims 6 miles up the James River in Richmond upstream against the current in this kind of feat of strength and prowess. So, you know, he was an athlete. And I think where we get the idea where the opposite was said as truth was the fact that he downplayed a lot of this later in life. And to be honest, it kind of fits in with that modern gothic narrative where you're not really interested in sports, you're not super cheerful or boastful or anything along those lines. You indulge in more intellectual pursuits like art or poetry or music or whatever you're into. But this was true of Poe. He was essentially a very cheerful jock type character. However, he did have his intellectual side, his sensitivities. He wanted to be with like-minded individuals who also wanted to indulge in the literary world and poetry and so on and so forth. And he really found that through his interactions with women. He believed that women were like angelic creatures to be worshipped. He saw his own mother as kind of a tragic angel. And we see this kind of play out with the relationships in his life. Now, one of these early relationships was when he was 16. This neighbor girl of his, by the name of Sarah Shelton, struck up a relationship with Poe, and like all teenage lovers, they decided to get engaged. However, at this time, Poe had begun his studies at the University of Virginia in order to study ancient and modern languages. And while he is there, her father intercepts his letters to her and has them destroyed, and basically makes her break off the engagement. And a lot of people believe that this had to do with his station in life. Her father didn't feel like he was successful enough or high enough in society to be engaged to his daughter. And to be honest, it was common amongst these southern aristocratic families during the antebellum period. And this has to do with the fact that even though he was raised by this wealthy Allan family and considered a part of the family, a lot of people saw him as the poor orphan boy, and he would gain a reputation for being kind of terrible with money, and it would all start in college. So at 16, Poe, he starts at the University of Virginia, and this was still in the crazy rough and tumble early days of the university. Because at the time, the University of Virginia was run a little differently than institutions that we see like Yale or Harvard, or if you go across to England, Oxford. The university was a rowdy, insane, crazy place. So real quick, I'm just going to dive into the early days of the University of Virginia so you understand kind of the environment we are dealing with. So this university was literally founded by Thomas Jefferson. So by the time Poe enters this college in 1826, it's only in like its second round of courses. This is a very new college. It was founded upon this principle of being separate from these old universities that focus on like a lot of religious practices. It was kind of the anti-university, or like the punk rock version of a university at the time. One of the founding principles was this idea of student self-government. Students were given the freedom to choose their own studies, make their own arrangements for boarding and housing, and to basically self-police, so any wrongdoings would be then reported to faculty. And even though they did have very strict rules against things like horses and guns and tobacco and alcohol and gambling, if you put a bunch of 16 to 21-year-olds together and tell them to self-govern, they are not going to adhere to those rules. During that first year of classes in 1825, brawls and fights and craziness would break out almost daily. It got so bad that even Jefferson had to interfere, and he was like astounded. But it's also to be said that a lot of these kids coming to this college, they were from spoiled aristocratic backgrounds. And when you are that age and you're given that freedom, you just basically go wild, especially if the structure is one of student governance. So Poe, he starts attending classes in 1826. And he's thrown into this environment. And this is where we hear two different stories about what happened during this year that Poe spent at this university. Now, Poe alleges that his foster father was very strict with money and didn't send him with sufficient money to cover things like lodging and books and basic necessities to sustain life. But in reality, the reason why Poe was broke was because he was gambling like crazy. And this being the early 1800s, gambling is a major form of entertainment. What else is there to do? Not a whole lot. And what we do know is Poe did incur a lot of gambling debt. And Allan, his foster father, he was forced to pay that debt. And this just draws more of that divide, because think about it. If you're a father figure to someone, you've taken this kid into your house, you're raising him, and you pay for him to get an education, and he gambles away all his college money, you're probably not going to be too thrilled with your son, especially if you want to instill the sense into the kid that hard work is what's going to get you that money. But despite that, it's said that in the year that he was there, he actually did really well in his studies. However, he couldn't afford a second year. And to be honest, I'm sure that he was not feeling welcome to come back to Richmond at this time. Especially when he finds out that, his engagement was broken off and that fiancé was now betrothed to another man. So instead of going back home, by April of 1827, he washes up in Boston. And at this time, he's living under a pseudonym. He's going by the name Henri Le Rene. And I imagine he's living under this pseudonym possibly to avoid people coming after him for these gambling debts that he incurred. Because at one point, his adoptive father is like, you know what? Nope, I'm not paying his debts. And those people that he owed money to are probably just like, well, you know what? If I see him on the street, I'm breaking his legs. Now, while he's living in Boston, he ends up doing odd jobs. He gets a job as a clerk. He also gets a job as a newspaper contributor, in which he's basically writing articles for newspapers, magazines, etc., all under this pseudonym. Of course, he's at this point still a nobody from nowhere, so he's probably just getting paid like the basic bare minimum, whatever you get paid for this. So realizing that he has no way to financially support himself, on May 27th of the same year, he enlists in the U.S. Army as a private, making $5 a month. He enlists under the pseudonym of Edgar A. Perry, and while he claimed he was 22 years of age, he was actually 18. I don't know why he lied about his age, but he was also lying about his name, so it probably had something to do with that. And his first post was at Fort Independence in Boston Harbor. In the same year, 1827, he does publish his first book. We know it today as Tamerlane and Other Poems. And this was a very short run. It was 50 copies, and it received literally no attention anywhere. However, it's crazy because it's now one of the rarest first editions in any kind of American literature. There are only 12 known to exist today. And you can see through these early works that a lot of his influence was based on the works of Lord Byron, and the themes generally follow romance, love, death, and pride. Now, obviously, with having these issues with his adopted father and possible debt collectors, and the fact that he's in the army under this pseudonym, it's simply released as written by a Bostonian. And the collection is introduced with an apologetic notice admitting the low quality of his poems. He states that they were never intended to be published, and why they are now published concerns no one. That's a direct quote. And he states that a majority of these poems were written in 1820 and 1821, quote, when the author had not completed his 14th year, end quote, which a lot of people think it might be an exaggeration. He probably wrote them when he was in college, to be honest. The whole thing's about 40 pages long and contains about 10 poems, the longest and most well-known one being Tamerlane. And the plot's pretty simple. It's about this warlord who's on his deathbed, and he's lamenting and regretting that he spent his life pursuing building this kingdom while ignoring the love of his life, which was this young peasant girl. Quote, a kingdom in exchange for a broken heart, end quote. And it's kind of crazy to think that this publication was so small and received so little attention that for like the first decade after his death, people didn't even think it existed until a copy was found in 1859. And about 12 copies have been found to this day. But despite whenever it was written, we do see a lot of his early influences which would shine throughout his later works. As I mentioned, primarily Lord Byron, who he totally fangirled over. I mean, throughout his work, and even in Tamerlane, he uses the name Ada for certain characters as kind of an homage to Lord Byron's daughter of the same name. So here we are, he's in Boston, which by the way was the city of his birth. That's where his mother was from, which is probably why he gravitated there in the first place. He's virtually abandoned his foster family, he's living under a pseudonym, he's enlisted in the army for this 5-year contract. And for those who are wondering, he was in the 1st Regiment of Artillery, so his job is very cannon-focused, which makes sense considering where he's stationed. Now, Poe actually thrives in the military, and he quickly makes his way up the enlisted ranks. By the end of 1827, he's promoted to, quote, artificer, which is basically an enlisted, skilled tradesman who was tasked with preparing artillery shells. And by the end of 1827, his monthly pay had doubled to $10 a month, which is livable back then. And by the time he's only been in the Army for 2 years, he attains the rank of Sergeant Major, which at the time was the highest rank a non-commissioned officer could receive. Now, after serving for 2 years of this 5-year contract, something happens. He decides he wants to end his 5-year contract early. I personally believe that it's because he wanted to become a commissioned officer and go to West Point. I mean, the dude literally jumped up the ranks in 2 years and was probably wanting to go higher. However, they're not just gonna let him end his enlistment early and just go to West Point. So he goes to his commanding officer, this guy named Lieutenant Howard, and he reveals his real name, he reveals his circumstances, blah, blah, blah. And Lieutenant Howard is like, well, Sergeant Major, I'll do what I can, I'll support your cause, I'll make it so you can be honorably discharged and go to West Point, but you have to reestablish ties with your adoptive father. Possibly because his adoptive father was going to be the key to getting him into West Point. Because part of the process when it comes to getting into West Point is you need to be nominated by somebody who is upstanding in society. Somebody who has some clout. So a lot of people will get sponsorships from their congressman or their senator. Sometimes it's just a prestigious community leader. So he's basically telling him, get in touch with your father, get your nomination, and get the process going for your entry into West Point. And in the meantime, start looking for a replacement to finish out your contract. So Poe, he writes a letter to his adoptive father. In fact, he writes him several letters. However, Allan doesn't respond, probably because he still feels hurt and kind of betrayed after, taking him in and raising him as if he were his own son. Just to have his wayward adoptive son accumulate a bunch of gambling debt, drop out of college, and disappear for 3 years. However, that does change because on February 28, 1829, his foster mother, Frances Allan, she dies from an illness. And Poe, he finally comes to visit on the day after her burial. And it's after this visit when he reconciles with his adoptive father and Allan decides to support his appointment for the U.S. Military Academy at West Point. So he's discharged on April 15th, 1829. But he doesn't immediately go to West Point. There's some wait time. They got to get all the stuff processed. So he spends the rest of 1829 in Baltimore, and he's living with his widowed aunt, a woman named Maria Clem, and her daughter, Virginia Eliza Clem, who would later become his wife because even in the 1800s, people were marrying their first cousins. I don't know. I think it's creepy. It's even creepier when you find out her age. And even creepier when you find out that a lot of historians will discount this age gap and say, oh, they had like a brother-sister-like relationship. It wasn't like that. No, straight up creepy, perverted stuff. And that's all I'll say on the subject because it disgusts me. Anyways, he's living in Baltimore at the time with his family, and the whole time he's still writing poetry. Off and on throughout his life, he's always writing poetry. It's always going on in the background. No matter what he's doing, no matter what job he has, he's always writing poetry. He's kind of like an early version of Charles Bukowski. And it's through this era of basically waiting to go to West Point and writing poetry when in September he says, and I quote, I received the very first words of encouragement I ever remember to have heard, end quote. And this praise for his work came from a literary critic who Poe really looked up to. His name was John Neal. And Poe was so excited about this that he dedicates one of his poems in a second book that he's currently writing at this point to Neal himself. And that book was called Al-Araf, Tamerlane and Minor Poems. And it was published in Baltimore in late 1829. And this was another one of those one-shot short publication runs. They say that no more than 500 were probably printed. Most estimate it to be around 250. And we get the number 250 because in a letter to John Allan when he was talking about this, that's the number he uses. However, today it's believed that there are only about 30 copies in existence. Now, the one poem that is mentioned from this work, Al-Araf, is Poe's longest poem that he ever wrote. It's like 406 lines. And he always claimed that this was a poem he wrote back when he was 15. However, Poe was always known to stretch the truth or exaggerate things. However, this poem was kind of a bomb. It received mostly negative views for its complexity, its structure, and all these obscure references because he was making references to the Quran. And a lot of people just didn't really get it. Most people were saying that it was hard to follow, it was almost intelligible. But the negative feedback did kind of change Poe's views because this was also the same problem with Tamerlane. It was simply too long, too ambitious. A lot of people said the thing feels like it runs out of steam halfway through. And after this, Poe started focusing on shorter poems, and these ones didn't seem to play around with the structure so much. So it's released and it's just unpopular, and people in the writing community think he's kind of a hack, or at best an amateur. So despite that setback, he eventually just says, you know what, doesn't matter, I'm still a poet. Plus, I'm heading to West Point, so I got a stable career ahead of me. So Poe travels to West Point and he matriculates as a cadet on July 1st, 1830. And for the first several months he's doing well. He's still in contact with John Allan. He's writing like these satirical poems about some of the officers and stuff for his classmates. And it's just like before, he's just good at army life. However, it all changes in October of that year. So John Allan, he marries his second wife, a woman named Louisa Patterson. And Poe, he's not too happy about this because he adored Allan's first wife, Frances, who had recently passed and was that one who took him in as a foster son. So in a way, he kind of felt like this was somewhat of a betrayal. Plus, there was the fact that Allan was known to have extramarital affairs, and he had bastard children from these extramarital affairs. And Poe would bicker and quarrel with Allan and these other children to the point where, towards the end of 1830, John Allan and his foster family completely disowns him. John's just like, I'm done with this kid. He wasn't grateful for anything I ever did for him. He's a loser. He's a bum. I'm just cutting him off for good. And Poe's like, well, you know what? Fine. Screw you and screw West Point. And he decides that he's going to intentionally leave West Point by getting court-martialed, which is precisely what happens. On February 8th, 1831, he was tried for gross neglect of duty and disobedience of orders for refusing to attend formations, classes, and church. He was then found guilty and dismissed from West Point. However, before he left, he was raising money from his fellow cadets in order to produce a third book. And he sold it to them by telling them that he was going to dedicate it to them and it was going to contain all the little humorous poems and stuff he had written while he was there. And he raises like $170 for this publication. So Poe's dismissed from West Point and he's writing this new book. It's simply called Poems. And it's just a rehash of all his earlier works. However, it contained none of the humorous and satirical poems that his fellow cadets who had financed this book had expected to see, because it was these humorous little poems that kind of made him like the campus rock star. However, when cadets are sent copies of these books, they are actually pissed. One of his former roommates had said that it was received with a general expression of disgust. Another cadet wrote in his copy that this book is a damn cheat, basically stating that Poe promised him one thing and delivered another, so he was cheated out of his money. And there were accounts of a fair number of cadets tossing their copies into the Hudson River. They were basically like, you know what, fuck this guy. They're like, this guy, he comes here, he's supposed to be this great soldier, gets himself court-martialed, and then he rips off a bunch of cadets by creating this mediocre poetry. What the hell? Screw this guy. And I'll remind you, he's only like 21 or 22 years old at this point. He's burned his bridges with his foster father, who's raised him and bailed him out and treated him like he was his own son. He's burned his bridges with the military now. And at this point, nobody really cares about his poetry. They see him as kind of a hack. And his fellow cadets from West Point basically see him at this point as a con man. So this really isn't Poe's finest hour. And now he's basically alone and prospectless. So with nowhere else to go, he returns to Baltimore to his aunt and his cousin. His older brother Henry, he also lives in the household. However, he dies in August of that year from complications of alcoholism. And it's at this point where he just doubles down on this idea that he's going to make his career as a writer and author. And this was a wild idea at the time because up until this point, being an author or a writer wasn't considered a career choice. At least not here in the United States. You couldn't make money and earn a living by doing this. And to really understand this, we have to understand what the publishing world looked like in 1830s America. So there's no international copyright laws. So American printers can just take works from British and European writers and just print those for essentially free, as opposed to paying American authors for new works vis-a-vis royalties, etc., etc. And also during this time, there's this booming growth in newspapers and periodicals across the United States. And most of these newspapers, these magazines, these literary reviews, whatever, they wouldn't last beyond a few issues. The general gist at the time was, well, it's becoming cheaper to produce books and articles in newspapers and magazines. Let's get some guys together and start a little company, start a little newspaper. But then more often than not, the newspaper or magazine or whatever, it fails. It doesn't generate a lot of traction. Nobody's interested in it. So the publishers of these newspapers and magazines, they either didn't pay the writers or they couldn't afford to pay the writers until much later. So it was at best extremely tough to make a career out of being a writer during this time in America. And to be honest, we see this same phenomena happening with the podcast boom here in the United States and the whole Instagram, TikTok, social media booms. But since I'm a podcaster, I'm just going to stick to this. So we see that exact same thing happening today. Everybody and their brother wants to go out and start a podcast. And why is that? Mostly because it's fun, it's easy, and it's really addictive once you get into it. But I would say 95% of the people who get into it entirely for the wrong reason. They get into it because they think it's going to be a quick, easy way to make a lot of money. But the true fact of the matter is you don't make a lot of money doing a podcast. And what little money you do make, it comes in little spurts. It's not consistent. Somebody might dedicate a few dollars one week and then, 6 months later, somebody else might donate a few dollars. If you're extremely lucky and your podcast gains some traction, you might start getting solicitations to run some ads. The point I'm making is it's not an instant success. And a lot of people get into it thinking they're going to be an instant success, but due to the fact that they really don't have a message or they really don't understand how the podcasting world works, they fall flat on their face, they get frustrated, and they quit after 3 episodes. And this was what was happening with the newspaper and publication industry of the 1830s. It's that exact same thing. Sorry for that digression, but that comparison kind of hit me, and I just figured I'd go with it because it's literally the same thing. So back to our topic, Poe. So throughout the early part of the 1830s, Poe, he's really getting nowhere with his writing career. He's literally begging people for money at some points. He's published a few stories in a few newspapers. In October of 1833, he gets a little bit of notoriety. He wins a prize for his short story, Message Found in a Bottle. That one was published in the Baltimore Saturday Visitor. I think the prize he got from that was like $50, which in today's money, it's like $1,900, so it was a pretty good prize. And Message in a Bottle is actually a really great story about a man lost at sea. Now, I'm not going to go into a discussion of Poe's works in this episode because I want you to go out and read them for yourself because they are really great. But I will give some basic plot synopses in this segment of the episode because this is where his literary career really takes off. So that publication, A Message in a Bottle, that gets the attention of a man named John P. Kennedy. He was a guy who lived in Baltimore who was very wealthy, and he sought Poe out and he helped him place some other stories in that newspaper, but more importantly, he introduces him to Thomas W. White, who was the editor of the Southern Literary Messenger in Richmond, Virginia. And after being introduced to White by 1835, he became the assistant editor of the Southern Literary Messenger. However, this first stint with the Southern Literary Messenger doesn't last long because only a few weeks into his job, he shows up to work drunk one day and gets fired. He once again returns to Baltimore with his aunt and his cousin, who at this time he decides he's going to marry because, let's be honest, he was a fucking pervert. He obtains a license to marry her. He tells the magistrates or whatever that she's 21. She was actually 13 and he was 26. And by the end of 1835, they're married. But at the time, he's broken out of work. He was just fired from the Southern Literary Review. And after that, he goes back to White and he literally begs for his job back. He says, I'm going to improve my behavior. I'm not going to drink on the job. I'm good to go. And White gives him a second chance. So he moves his aunt and his now wife to Richmond, and he continues to work for the Southern Literary Messenger. And during his time there, he is in a writing and publishing frenzy. He publishes several poems and book reviews and critiques and essays and articles. He's just a prolific writer at this point, and he's probably making a steady salary at this point, being the assistant editor of this literary review, this newspaper essentially. And he would go on to boast that during his time there, he increased circulation of this newspaper from just 700 subscribers up to 3,500 subscribers. However, we know that Poe was known to exaggerate the truth. Now, it was on May 16th, 1836, when he and Virginia were officially married at a Presbyterian wedding ceremony in their Richmond boarding house. And I'm saying officially married because I guess this is when they were publicly married. But it's possible they were already legally married because they did have that marriage license way back in September of 1835. And Poe, he continues to work at the Southern Literary Messenger until about 1837. And my best guess is he left to seek out better opportunities because by that next year, he relocates to Philadelphia. And in that same year, he produces his only novel. It was the narrative of Arthur Gordon Pym of Nantucket. And this is a full novel. It has 25 chapters and around 72,000 words. It's his only complete novel. And it's basically a story of this guy who is on this whaling ship and he has all these adventures. There are storms, mutinies, cannibalism, ghost ships. They end up on a desert island for a while. There's a lot of references to Antarctica and the South Pole, which was kind of a new, mysterious thing at the time. People were actually searching for it at this time. And Poe even recounts it's a very silly book. However, when it was published, it wasn't published under Poe's name. He published it as an account of Pym himself. And this novel was pretty much torn apart by the critics. It received very unfavorable reviews. One reviewer, Poe's future rival, Lewis Gaylord Clark, who we'll talk about later, he said it was told in a loose, slipshod style. He said it was overly violent and filled with blood and gore. A lot of other critics kind of corroborated that. They said it was excessively violent. Overall, it wasn't a very popular novel. However, in later years, people like Herman Melville and Jules Verne would go on to state that it was very influential in their works. And isn't that just the story of every artist out there, unappreciated in their own time, but after they inevitably die, their work becomes the most appreciated work ever by future generations? I'm pretty sure that's a tale as old as humanity itself. So Poe creates this book and it's kind of a flop, and this is during a time known as his blank year. He's not really producing works. He probably spent the whole year working on this book. And we don't really have a great idea of what he's doing at this time. A lot of people believe that he was probably just looking for any kind of lucrative work he could get at this time. Because now at this time, he has a 14-year-old wife to take care of. So he's probably begging for money, borrowing money, probably doing odd jobs wherever he can while working on this novel. But by the summer of 1839, he gets another break because he becomes the assistant editor of Burton's Gentleman's Magazine. And it was basically this monthly produced magazine which included poems, fiction, essays, had an emphasis on American sporting life, like articles featuring sailing and cricket and hunting and stuff like that. It was inspired by a popular magazine in London known as the Gentleman's Magazine, and they wanted this to be the American version of that. So Poe gets hired on, and they're paying him essentially $10 a week, and he's supposed to basically publish articles for it. And Poe says he only actually dedicated like 2 hours a day to this job because I guess it was fairly easy for him to just pump out this material. But it's through this literary magazine and its successor, Graham's Magazine, who Poe would also go on to work for, where Poe starts producing some of his more recognizable works that we would know today. So for example, in August of 1839, he publishes The Fall of the House of Usher. In 1841, after this merger where it becomes Graham's Magazine, Poe publishes The Murders in the Rue Morgue, widely known as the first detective story. And at this time, he's a critic and the editor of this magazine, and he's given an annual salary of $800, which is about $30,000 today, so he's not making minimum wage, but he's not quite middle class. And by this time, Poe has made a little bit of a name for himself in the literary world. Graham actually keeps him on because he has kind of a name in the literary world as a critic. And while Poe stayed in this role, he would constantly complain that he didn't really care for the direction that the magazine was taken because it would focus on fashion and music and love tales, while Poe was producing basically the opposite of that, these dark, gritty tales of horror and deceit and murder. But despite that, he keeps Poe on because Poe's starting to become a common name in literary circles. And it's through this work with this magazine where he really does attain that reputation of being a harsh literary critic. At one point, another poet and literary critic at the time stated that Poe would often mistake his vial of prussic acid for his inkwell, as kind of a little jab to his harsh criticisms. Now, in 1842, Poe leaves Graham's employee, however, he still made occasional contributions to the magazine. And in 1847, he voluntarily took a cut in the usual payment of $4 per page to cover a debt that he owed Graham. And at this point, it's obviously clear that Poe was never good with money. This doesn't come up very much, but Poe was an alcoholic. He probably drank most of his money away. But it seems that after he left Graham's employee in 1842, he would complain that his little measly payment, or in his words, his namby-pamby payment of $800 was basically pathetic when compared to the fact that Graham's was bringing in $25,000 in profit a year. So I imagine Poe probably thought that he was entitled to more money. But it was around this time in 1842 when Poe would embark on a feud with another literary critic and author, which would last through the rest of his life, and that man was a man known as Rufus W. Griswold. Now, generally the tale goes that Griswold was the guy who replaced Poe after Poe resigned from Graham's Magazine, and that's what started the feud, but the feud actually started a lot earlier. So at this time in 1842, Poe has established himself as an influential critic and writer, and he was displeased with a review that Griswold had made of his works in his publication called The Poets and Poetry of America. And in a response to kind of this lukewarm review of Poe's works, Poe questioned the quality of the poets that Griswold had included in the anthology, especially Henry Wadsworth Longfellow, whom Poe accused of plagiarism at one point. But Griswold just basically thought that Poe was full of himself, he thinks he's always perfect, blah blah blah. He kind of blows Poe off. So they start out with somewhat of a tense relationship, but it only worsens after Poe leaves Graham's and is replaced by Griswold. And Griswold is offered a higher salary, $1,000 a year, as opposed to Poe's $800 a year. Now, to Poe's surprise, Griswold actually came to him at one point and asked him if he could review the poets and poetry of America. And Poe, in his mind, he took this as, hey, this guy's bribing me to give him a good review. So while he does give the book a favorable review, it wasn't as favorable as Griswold had expected. And it would kind of come back to irk Graham in the future when Poe would go on a series of lectures on this East Coast lecture tour. And while talking about this publication, he would state that Griswold publishes his friends' works, but not good works. And 1842 is really a turning point in Poe's life because in January of 1842, Virginia, she starts to show the first signs of consumption or tuberculosis, which Poe described as the breaking of a blood vessel in her throat while she was singing and playing the piano one evening. And Poe recognized the signs of consumption. His own mother had died from consumption, and other people in his life had died of the same illness. And it's during this time when he really takes to the bottle. He is heavily drinking in order to deal with the stress. It's also during this time where he's angling for a government post or a government position because he feels he'd be more secure if he had that, government job. And at this time, John Tyler is president. For those who don't know, because honestly, who remembers John Tyler? He was the 10th president of the United States. He was originally William Henry Harrison's vice president, but since William Henry Harrison died 30 days into his term, John Tyler took the role as president, and it actually caused a lot of political questions to be asked about presidential succession at this time because this had never happened before. But he's the one who sets the precedent that the vice president succeeds the president in the result of a death. He did some other stuff too, but importantly he sided with the Whig Party. But he was a slaveholder and for states' rights, and actually in 1861, when the Confederacy succeeded, he sided with them late in his life. But Poe, he wants a job in Tyler's administration, and Poe, let's remember, he was raised in Virginia by a slave-dealing Southern aristocrat. So his political views most likely aligned with Tyler's political views. So Poe, claiming to be a member of the Whig Party, hopes that he can get appointed to the United States Custom House in Philadelphia. And he hopes to secure this job through a friend who was friends with the president's son. However, when it came time to actually show up for the appointment to be given the job, Poe claimed that he was sick and he never showed up for the appointment. A lot of people think he didn't show up simply because he was drunk. And unfortunately, this government position that he was coveting for this short time went to someone else. So after failing to acquire this government post, Poe, he's doing a couple of different things. He spends the years between 1843 and 1845 traveling up the East Coast in these series of lectures on American poetry. And these were highly successful lectures because, the guy knows his stuff. And it's during these lectures where he really chastises Griswold, his old rival, and kind of flaming this little feud they had between the two. It was also during this time when Poe moves to New York and he's working briefly at the Evening Mirror, which was another one of these newspapers. And then by 1844, he becomes the editor of the very short-lived Broadway Journal. And by short-lived, I mean this newspaper probably lasted 2 years. I think by 1846 it was done. And at this time, Poe, still being a literary critic, he is basically alienating himself from all these other American writers. He goes on this long tirade about how contemporary writers confuse their source with their own thoughts. So he's basically stating, you don't have an original thought in your head, you stole your ideas from whoever inspired you. And a lot of these guys are like, dude, get off your high horse, that's what every artist does, it's called inspiration. But he kind of doubles down on this, and it really starts to piss off a lot of his contemporaries. But on January 29th, 1845, Poe's life changes again because that's when his most famous poem is published, The Raven. And everybody knows The Raven. It is the very first poem we think of when we hear the name Edgar Allan Poe. So on that day, it was published in the Evening Mirror, and it was concurrently published in the American Review, a Whig journal. And he was paid $9 for this publication. In 2024 dollars, it's about $300. And it's an instant hit. It goes on to sensationalize Poe. It's made him a household name. This is his big moment. It's literally what every artist dreams of. That big moment where your work is finally recognized and you made it, and usually 9 times out of 10, it's on some mundane project that you didn't think was going to go anywhere. But The Raven is an instant success and Poe is on top of the world. And all of a sudden, he's the talk of the town. They're republishing it in every newspaper and magazine and literary review, and it's coming out to rave reviews. And Poe is a rock star at this point. He's going to lectures and he's literally like going to like people's houses, rich people's houses, just so he can recite this poem. And it's instantly parodied and illustrated, and there's all this success and buzz, except for monetary success. Poe doesn't make a lot of money off The Raven, and true to his nature, any money he did make, he most likely squandered on alcohol. But 1845, that is the year of Poe. But the good times don't last forever, because with every one-hit wonder, that popularity eventually fades. By the end of 1845 and into 1846, he's focusing more on the Broadway Journal, the newspaper that he now owns. However, shortly after gaining ownership, it fails. It completely fails in 1846. At one point, he actually reaches out to his old rival, Rufus Griswold, for a loan of $50 in order to keep his newspaper going. And Griswold actually does lend Poe $25 in order to keep the publication going, but the publication does ultimately fail. And the Poes, they once again fall on hard times, especially in 1847 when on January 30th, at the cottage that they lived in the Bronx, Virginia dies from tuberculosis. And this was really that straw that broke the camel's back. It was the final breaking point for Poe, because after this, he dives even deeper in alcoholism, and his behavior becomes extremely erratic. And it remains erratic for the rest of his life. At least that's what the common thought is. Me personally, when I looked into Poe's life, I see a constant string of behaviors that suggest some kind of underlying mental illness. Now, I am in no way qualified to diagnose mental illness whatsoever, but when we look at Poe's life, I don't think it's outside of the possibility that he maybe struggled with something like bipolar disorder or maybe borderline personality disorder. I think some kind of mental disorder along those lines could really help us understand some of the actions he took in life. However, after Virginia dies, it's pretty much all downhill from there. But at this time, Poe is only about, 38, 39? He's roughly my age right now. So it's not too long after this when he starts to look for a potential new wife. For a short time, he attempts to court the poet Sarah Helen Whitman, who lived in Providence, Rhode Island. However, their engagement failed due to his erratic behavior and his erratic drinking, and probably the fact he was constantly in poverty. However, after that fails, he returns to Richmond and he begins to resume the relationship with Sarah Royster from his childhood, that girl that left him for another man when he was in college. And this really leads up to the mystery of his death, and this is a mystery that still hasn't been solved to this very day. So it starts in July of 1849, where he travels to Richmond in order to explore a possible magazine venture and to hook up with his ex. And when he arrived there, he stated that he was suffering from the effects of a cholera attack accompanied by hallucinations. Now, he insisted this wasn't alcohol related, but at the time, he was drinking extremely heavily, and you couple that with maybe a mental disorder that's been exacerbated by his wife's early death, he could have been completely mentally off the rails at this point. However, it states that he recuperates from this, and throughout his stay in Richmond from July through September, he's giving this series of lectures and readings in order to basically make money. So on September 27th, he departs from Richmond to go back to New York. It's believed that he's accepted an editor's job, and at this time he's planning on remarrying the sweetheart who he just rekindled with. Now, all we know about what happens next comes from a few different, somewhat conflicting accounts. So Poe is not seen again until October 3rd, and he's literally found delirious in a gutter outside of Ryan's Tavern. It's also known as Gunner's Hall. He's completely out of it, he's not wearing his own clothes, and it's stated at least once or twice at the time that he was in a state of beastly intoxication. That's the quote. And he's just an absolute mess. So while he's lying here in this gutter, a printer named Joseph Walker finds him. He pulls him out of the gutter. He basically gets him to the hospital, and they're trying to figure out who he is. They find out that this is Edgar Allan Poe, and then they find out that he has an acquaintance by the name of Joseph Snodgrass. So they write him a letter. And the letter actually reads as follows: "Dear Sir, there is a gentleman, rather the worse for wear, at Ryan's 4th Ward polls, who goes under the cognomen of Edgar Allan Poe, and who appears in great distress, and he says he is acquainted with you, and I assure you he is in need of your immediate assistance. Yours in haste, Joseph W. Walker." So this acquaintance, Snodgrass, his first-hand account describes Poe's appearance as, quote, "repulsive, with unkempt hair, a haggard, unwashed face, and lusterless and vacant eyes. His clothing included a dirty shirt with no vest and unpolished shoes which did not fit well and were very worn." And Poe's attending physician, a man named John Joseph Moran, he gave this description of Poe as he was, I guess, coming into the hospital. The man wore a stained, faded, old bombazine coat, pantaloons of a similar character, and a pair of worn-out shoes run down at the heels, and an old straw hat. Now, all the parties involved stated that this man was wearing clothes that were clearly not his own. Which is most likely true. Let's remember, Poe was raised in a Southern aristocratic family. He wouldn't be seen wearing shabby clothes. It was completely out of character for a antebellum era refined Southern gentleman to dress like this. Now, Poe was taken to Washington College Hospital on Broadway and Fayette Street, and he was placed in a section of the hospital which was reserved for drunkards. And Poe, being completely incoherent at this point and completely out of it, they thought that he was a drunkard. And usually with the drunks who show up at the hospital, they basically put them in a room that's not too different from a prison cell, and they kind of let them just dry out. And the whole time he's in this room, he's completely incoherent, he's completely out of his mind, he can't clearly state the circumstances as to why he ended up where he ended up in that gutter. But while he's in the hospital, they do extract little tidbits of information from him. For example, Moran, the physician attending to him, he said that at one point when Poe is awake, he tries to cheer him up by claiming that his friends would be with him soon. And it's alleged that when Poe heard this, he replied, quote, "The best thing his friend could do would be to blow his brains out with a pistol," end quote. At one point during this, he makes a reference to a wife in Richmond. It's not known if he was talking about his deceased wife, Virginia Clem, believing in a delusional state that she was still alive, or possibly referencing Sarah Royster, to whom he had recently proposed. They also tried to figure out what happened to his trunk of belongings, which he had no clue about. They were later found to have been left behind at the Swain Tavern in Richmond. And then it stated that on the night before his death, he was screaming out the name Reynolds. And there are 1,000 different hypotheses as to why he was screaming out this name. But the possibility that I go with comes from that tavern he was found in front of. So Poe was there pretty much on election day, and this tavern was one of the polling places, and one of the judges overseeing the 4th Ward polls was a man named Henry R. Reynolds. And it's believed that Poe may have met this man that day, and that's why he was screaming out his name. And to be honest, this brings us to one, and personally I think it's the most likely possibility of what happened to Poe. He was a victim of a trend called cooping. And for that, we have to briefly discuss a little bit about voting in America in the 1840s, because it was nothing like it is today. Back then, elections were wild, raucous affairs. And we didn't have like voting machines and stuff like we have today. This is old school. This is you write a name on a slip and drop it in a box. Or in the case of the illiterate who still wanted to vote, usually they would just be told to check one box or another for their political candidate, and they'd just be told, okay, this is this guy, check one of the boxes. Or, there were other numerous ways to vote too, but it was basically put a name in a box. And back then, people took politics as seriously as people do today. And with that came rampant fraud, especially in the 19th century. And this led to a practice known as cooping, which is basically an electoral fraud scheme. So basically the scheme is you would have these gangs who were directly working for the political candidates, and they were on both sides, and everybody knew about these gangs. It wasn't a big secret. And they would literally go out and they would literally grab people off the street, drag them into the pub, the tavern, wherever. Sometimes they drag them into a basement or whatever. And they get like 20 people that they've literally kidnapped off the street. And most of the time they were plying them with free alcohol. So you go in, you get a shot of alcohol, you go out, you vote, you come back. You get another shot of alcohol, maybe a change of clothes, maybe they shave you, whatever. They change your appearance, they give you another name, and you go vote again. And then the cycle continues. And these people would comply because if they didn't comply, these gangs of men would beat the living snot out of them to make them comply. And it's like, you can't go to the police about this in this time because the police are barely existent. So you endure a day of getting shit-faced off of alcohol, going, voting, coming back, changing clothes, voting, coming back, getting your beard shaved, going back, voting, another clothing change, another name change, whatever. You keep going back to the polls and you're essentially stuffing the ballot box in the favor of your political candidate. A really funny depiction of it actually came from that film Gangs of New York. Now in that film it was shown in more of a lighthearted tone. It was almost like a joke. But that was a true thing that happened on election day in a lot of these major East Coast cities. And it's believed that this is what happened to Poe. It's believed that Poe probably was dragged into this tavern, plied with alcohol, made to vote several times, made to change his clothes several times. And he probably didn't have to be forced into this because remember, he was a rampant alcoholic at this point. He probably voluntarily did this just to get that next shot of whiskey. Up until the point where he passes out in the gutter, and then it's like, well, who cares? Now, that viewpoint on Poe, that he was a habitual alcoholic, is controversial. A lot of people don't like that viewpoint, but I'm just putting together what I saw as I read it. I personally believe that he was extremely alcohol dependent, and that alcohol dependency led him into this cooping scheme. But regardless, he does end up in the hospital. He's completely delirious. He's out of it. And on October 7th, 1849, he says his final words, which were famously accounted as, "Lord help my poor soul," before dying. Now, his actual cause of death has been heavily disputed because no death records were ever found, if they were even created. People have thrown out all kinds of hypotheses about what happened to Poe, why he died exactly. However, most people believe that it probably had something to do with alcoholism or alcohol poisoning. That's the general conclusion that gets thrown around. Now, Poe's funeral, it was a very small affair. It was held the next day on Monday, October 8th, 1849 in Baltimore. It was only attended by about 6 or 7 people, and the whole affair only lasted 3 minutes. The Reverend didn't even bother to do a sermon because the crowd was so small. Now, Poe's uncle, he provided a cheap mahogany coffin, a very simple one. The wife of his attending physician, Moran, was the one who made his burial shroud. And in typical Poe fashion, even the weather was recorded as a dark and gloomy day, not raining, but just kind of raw and threatening. He was buried without a headstone near the rear corner of the churchyard near his grandfather, a man named David Poe Sr. Later, it said that a headstone that was made for him was destroyed on its way to the gravesite. So his gravesite was marked with a little sandstone marker that just said number 80. So he's basically in a pauper's grave. But in 1873, a Southern poet named Paul Hamilton Hayne visits Poe's grave, and he talks about the deplorable nature of it. Here's this great literary giant whose grave is basically gone unkempt and is barely recognizable. So they raise a bunch of money and they purchase this great monument for him. Then on October 1st, 1875, he's exhumed and reburied towards the front of the church in this new, like, kind of monument type grave. You know, it's the touristy, like, grave we see today of Poe. And then by 1885, Virginia is reburied next to Poe, all in this little cemetery. And after his death, his literary works are finally recognized, and he's the great American poet of gothic horror, and he created the modern detective novel, and he would go on to inspire hundreds, if not thousands, of future authors, even inspiring authors to this day. And of course, after he dies, there's this vicious character assassination by his old rival. Say that he was a hack, an opium addict, a drunk, and all this other stuff, and that really carries through, which, to be honest, might influence some of my biases towards his alcoholism. However, we see numerous times in his life where he's struggling with alcoholism, so the thought that he was kind of a notorious drunk and he died in a drunken haze isn't outside the realm of possibility for me. And that kind of becomes the narrative of Poe. Up until today, we still think, oh, he was crazy, he was deranged, he was a drunk, he was an opium addict, and people believe that he lived this insane life, when in fact he was just a guy who burned his bridges at a young age and really struggled throughout the last 15-20 years of his life, because he could have gone on to inherit his adopted father's businesses or a portion of said businesses and lived an easy life as a Southern aristocrat. He could have stayed at West Point and became a great military officer. But if he did do that, if he did choose those paths, we'd never know his name and his works wouldn't exist. He's a guy who basically gave a big middle finger to all of that and said, I'm going to strike it out on my own. I'm going to make my living with my pen. And yeah, it's going to be a struggle, but, you know, life is full of struggle. And he embodied that to the core. But there was one final enduring legend that Poe left us, and that was in the form of the Poe toaster. So this starts sometime in Baltimore around Poe's gravesite in the 1930s. So one night, sometime in the 1930s on January 19th, which was Poe's birthday, there were accounts that in the early hours of this morning, a black-clad figure carrying a silver-tipped cane, his face obscured by a scarf or hood, entered the Westminster Hall and Burying Ground in Baltimore. And at the site of Poe's original grave, which is marked with a commemorative stone, this figure would pour a glass of Martell cognac, which, for those who don't know, Martell is the oldest of the big four cognac houses. But this figure would take this glass and raise a toast to Poe. The figure would then arrange 3 roses on the monument in a distinctive configuration and depart, leaving the unfinished bottle of cognac at the site. And this started happening year after year to the point where it was becoming like a media sensation, because nobody knew who this mysterious Poe toaster was or this series of Poe toasters, because it went on for decades. Now, on several occasions, the toaster would leave a note, and usually it would have a cryptic message or some kind of devotion, such as like, Edgar, I've never forgotten you. But in 1993, a message appeared that stated, quote, the torch will be passed. And in 1999, another note stated that the original toaster had passed on. And eyewitnesses after this seem to comment that, yeah, the toaster looks as if they are a different or a younger person. However, by the end of the 2010s, the one who took up the torch decided for whatever reason not to do it anymore. Of course, not wanting the tradition to die out, the city of Boston took it upon themselves to hold a competition to select a new individual to be the new Poe toaster. And the Historical Society named this new Poe toaster as this forever anonymous guy. And now it's all played up for touristy reasons. But Poe's impact on Baltimore seems to have been his biggest impact of all. I mean, even their football team is called the Baltimore Ravens, and it comes from the Raven. Baltimore famously claims Poe as their own, even though he lived kind of a little bit of everywhere on the eastern seaboard. But in the end, Poe was an extremely influential literary genius. I know I didn't really discuss his works in this, and it's as I said before, I didn't want to use this to discuss his works. If you want to read them, go read them. I highly encourage it. But I really wanted to dig into the life of this great horror icon because he really did become that great gothic horror icon. I mean, to be honest, that whole goth look that you see, it's really reminiscent of tuberculosis imagery. And that imagery does get played up throughout his works, mostly because he experienced tuberculosis firsthand throughout his life several times. And it's just very tragic that outside of The Raven, none of his works were really celebrated in his lifetime. Although they did go on to influence many other works in many other genres, and all these modern authors, they really stand upon the shoulders of Poe's original work. But on that note, I do believe I will end it here. I will be honest, I have been working on this episode for 6 months. Mostly because I didn't really know how to approach it, so I just thought, okay, let's just do a real gritty biography of this dude's real life. Because if I had gotten out into the weeds when it came to his works, I could be talking for hours and hours, and I really wanted to launch this in October, so I had to cut back a lot. Which I guess goes to show how dedicated I am to this podcast. But as I said, if you're still listening and you've managed to make it this far for whatever god-awful reason, I don't know, maybe you're a masochist, whatever, I highly encourage you to read his works if you never have, or if you read them way back in high school, go back and reread them, because you will find a deep appreciation for this author. And I'm just going to list off some of my favorite works that are great introductory stories for anyone who wants to read Poe. I'm going to start with The Cask of Amontillado because that's a personal favorite of mine. I implore anyone to read The Fall of the House of Usher and The Murders in the Rue Morgue. The Telltale Heart is an instant classic if it comes to a first-time reader of Poe. The Pit and the Pendulum is a great one. The Goldbug is a really great read if you're into like cryptography and treasure hunting. And I would highly encourage anyone to read the narrative of Arthur Gordon Pym of Nantucket. That is his only novel. And I will say, when you read it, it is a really gritty read. Like, there's some racist undertones in it, and they're not subtle because, let's remember, this was just a different time in America, so you have to read it from that mindset. It is difficult for us to do in that modern age, but if you can kind of break down those walls and see it from that perspective, then you'll kind of get a better understanding of Poe's worldviews. And of course, if you've never actually sat down and read it, The Raven, I mean, that is the poem. You literally cannot go wrong reading The Raven, especially at this time of year, because it's Halloween. And I will state that finally that is all I have for today. As always, this is Mike, this is Urban Legends and Mythology. I truly thank you all for listening, especially anybody who listened to it this far in. If you do like what I'm doing and you want to support it, you can always follow it on all the platforms, particularly Spotify. If you want, you can go join the other like 30 or 40 people who listen to it on YouTube for whatever reason. As always, you can also support this show by going to that link in the description of every episode. Or if you don't want to do any of that, just introduce a friend to this podcast. Word of mouth is truly how this thing spreads, and the proof of that is, as of recording right now, we just hit country number 62. Now, I do record these out of order, so it might conflict with a future episode where I mention what number country we're on, but right now it's 62. And for that, I am truly appreciative. So, once again, this is Mike. I thank you for listening, and I will see you in the next one.